Hello, guys. Welcome to Through the Veil. I'm Cameron, and today we're going to be doing a podcast on the Mountain Meadows massacre. We're going to be talking about one of the most tragic events in Latter-day Saint history, arguably the worst event in Latter-day Saint history. Now, the reason I've decided to do a podcast on this is because this is one of the most misquoted and misunderstood events in church history. Many members of the church cite the Mountain Meadows massacre as a reason for actually leaving the church. And although what happened was inexcusable and tragic and awful, there is no reason that this event should be a reason for you to leave or stay in the church. It has nothing to do with the truth claims of the church. So we're going to spend the first part of the podcast talking about what happened and what it is. And we'll spend the last part dissecting its impact on Latter-day Saint culture. So let's start with the cold hard facts. From September 7th to September 11th, 1857, the Baker Fancher wagon train was attacked and then massacred at Mountain Meadows in southern Utah. The victims were immigrants traveling mostly from Arkansas toward California. The killings were carried out by local Latter-day Saint militia, aided by some Paiute Indians, although we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Around 120 men, women, and older children were killed. 17 young adults were spared 17 young children were spared because they were considered too young to testify clearly about what had happened. So basically, guys, anybody that could talk was killed, and only very, very young people were spared. Now, what leads Latter-day Saints to kill that many innocent people? It's inexcusable, but we have to understand the context and where their head was at. At the time that this was going on, there was a lot of tension in the United States between the U.S. government and, of course, the Mormon settlers out west. There was a lot of talk that Johnson's army, which was marching toward Utah at the time of the massacre, was coming to destroy the Latter-day Saints, destroy the temples that were under construction. The massacre happened during the Utah War, when the United States government was sending an army to the Utah Territory to replace Brigham Young as governor. Many Latter-day Saints believed another violent conflict with outsiders was beginning. That fear did not cause the massacre by itself, but it created the atmosphere in which rumors, military language, and local panic became extremely dangerous. Church leaders had preached resistance to the approaching army, and southern Utah communities were already on edge. Now, Brigham Young, the beginning and the end of his involvement in the Mountain Meadows massacre is he talked about how Latter-day Saints were going to be willing, to fire on U.S. soldiers from the canyon walls. He was talking about getting ready to have a physical war with the U.S. government. Now, it's called the Utah War, but it's important to remember that, at least to my knowledge, no firefights ever actually broke out between the Latter-day Saints and the government. It's a description of a period of time. Now, this was the beginning and end, again, of Brigham Young's contribution to the Mountain Meadows massacre. Now, you can debate whether or not that rhetoric was good or bad, or whether or not it made sense, but Brigham Young never directly ordered the execution of the massacre. That came down to the locals. Now, what exactly was the nature of the Baker Fancher wagon train, the immigrants that were attacked? The Baker Fancher party was a group of immigrants traveling by wagon toward California. Many were families with livestock, supplies, and hopes of finding better economic opportunities in the West. As they moved through Utah, they entered a territory already filled with suspicion. They were outsiders passing through at the worst possible moment, when many saints feared invasion, betrayal, and renewed violence from the United States. So, unfortunately, they came through Utah looking for supplies, looking to stock up, and they came through at the worst possible time. They were seen as outsiders. You see, they were Gentiles in the land of God's covenant people. And a lot of them were bragging that not a lot of them, there was a rumor that one of them said they had the gun that killed Joseph Smith. Another group of these immigrants went to the house of Latter-day Saints Isaac C. Haight. He was the stake president at the time, and they threatened to kill him. Now, there were a lot of threats or a lot of nasty words and a lot of nasty things being said, but never once did the wagon train ever inflict any kind of violence on the Latter-day Saint settlers. Another thing we need to remember about this historical event is that the only side that we have record of is the Latter-day Saint side. Nothing from the Baker Fancher wagon train survived. We don't have their side of the story at all. Unfortunately, it has lost to history and probably will be forever. So that's another thing to understand about this event. We only have half the story. So when we're analyzing history and when we're analyzing historical events and trying to figure out what happened, it's important to understand the context. So in southern Utah, some Latter-day Saints refused to trade with the immigrants. It says some. Really, what I meant to put was many. Rumors also spread that some members of the wagon train had insulted the Saints or claimed connection to earlier violence against them, like the rifle that killed Joseph Smith. The important thing is that these stories were rumors. There was no solid proof. Historians warn that later accounts are messy and sometimes unreliable. Even if some immigrants behaved badly, nothing they did justified violence against the entire wagon train. Now, something important to remember here is that local leaders, including Isaac C. Haight, John D. Lee, John Higbee, and others became involved in discussions about what to do with the wagon train. William H. Dame, a militia commander, was also connected to the chain of local military authority. So what started happening was there was all these weird confrontations with the wagon train. And local Latter-day Saints, they wanted to attack. They wanted to steal some cattle. They wanted to maybe hurt a few of them. I don't know if at this point they were on record talking about killing the immigrants, but there was certainly a lot of talk about inflicting some kind of violence against them. However, it's important to understand that some leaders said, listen, this is all just words. They have not made any vocal, actual threats against us. They have not done any wrong to us, so words are words. We just need to leave them alone. The final decisions that led to the massacre came from local southern Utah leaders, not from a clear written order from Brigham Young. Again, this is where, for some reason, movies, TV shows, other podcasts, this is where it all gets mixed up. Brigham Young had absolutely nothing to do with the massacre. Yes, he did contribute to the rhetoric that put people in a headspace where they were willing to do something like this. But Brigham Young himself had nothing to do with it. This was all with the local leadership. Now, as far as the first attack, on September 7th, 1857, Paiutes and local militiamen, some disguised as Native Americans, attacked the wagon train at Mountain Meadows. The immigrants fought back by circling their wagons and digging defensive positions. The first attack failed to destroy the company. Instead, it turned into a siege that lasted several days. As the immigrants continued to resist, the attackers became increasingly afraid that survivors would identify the white militiamen involved. Now, it's important to note here that there were some Paiute Indians there. However, most of the militiamen tried to disguise themselves as Paiutes because they wanted to pin the entire thing on the Native Americans. Now, they were able to talk the Paiutes into this by saying they would also kill them and that they would bring more white settlers that wouldn't be as friendly to the Native Americans. So some Paiutes were manipulated into participating in this, although their involvement was very minimal at most. Now, it's important to note that Isaac C. Haight and all the other church leaders at the time, they did send letters north to Salt Lake. They sent a writer to see what they should do about the immigrant train. However, they decided to attack before any messages arrived. During the crisis, a messenger was sent to Salt Lake City to ask Brigham Young what should be done. This matters because it shows that local leaders knew they did not yet have Young's direction. Rather than waiting for the reply, the local leaders moved forward. According to the church's gospel topic essay and Mormoner, great website, Young's eventual reply told them not to interfere with the immigrants and to let them go in peace, but the message arrived too late. At this point, as the siege continued, local leaders decided on a deceptive plan. They would approach the wagon train under a flag of truce and promise protection if the immigrants surrendered their weapons. This plan turned the immigrants' trust into a weapon against them. The survivors were separated into groups, making it easier for the militia to kill them away from their defensive position. On September 11th, 1857, John D. Lee approached the wagon train under a flag of truce, the white flag. The immigrants were told that they would be protected and escorted away from Mountain Meadows if they surrendered. After leaving their fortified camp, the men were separated from the women and children, and at a prearranged signal, the militia attacked. Nearly the entire wagon train was killed, with only 17 young children surviving. So again, that's another layer to the disgust and to the sadness of this whole event. They surrendered, and they honestly, at this point, maybe they could have negotiated with the immigrants. They could have maybe, apologized, offered some kind of a truce. They could have ended this whole thing before it devolved into something awful. But instead, the militia and the Latter-day Saint leadership that was there decided to kill everybody so that there would be no witnesses. Now, why did they decide to kill everybody except for the children? Well, there was probably some concern that when the immigrant train made it to California, that they would spread what had happened to them, that the Latter-day Saints attacked them for no reason, that the Latter-day Saints, attempted to kill all of them. And this, of course, would cause a lot of problems for Latter-day Saints moving forward and probably would have resulted in the government coming down even harder on the church. And so that is probably how they were able to justify that decision to themselves. It goes without saying that this is completely inexcusable. And I've been reading Latter-day Saint history on and off for a few years now. And far and away, this is the darkest thing I have ever read about our church and about members of the church and what they have done to other people. It's so dark and it's so awful. And to think that these young children went the rest of their lives without their parents and that they were killed for no reason. It just really goes to show just how powerful rhetoric can be. Now, after the massacre, participants and local leaders tried to shift the blame onto the Paiutes, as planned. This version of the story hid the central role played by local Latter-day Saint militiamen. The surviving children were taken into local homes and were later returned to relatives in Arkansas mostly. The victims' property and livestock were also taken or distributed, adding another layer of wrongdoing after the killings themselves. And so they killed, they stole, they lie. Look at the Ten Commandments and look at what happened here. I mean, talk about a group of people not following their religion. And this is such a common theme. It's seen throughout history. You saw it with 9/11. You see it with all sorts of different events in history, that the religion of the perpetuators of atrocity gets blamed. I don't blame the Catholic Church for whatever atrocities they committed throughout history, or for whatever atrocities Catholics have committed throughout history. If a Catholic commits a crime, commits a genocide, commits murder, that's not the fault of the Catholic Church. You can go to the leaders of the Catholic Church, you can go to the scriptures that they believe in, and you can read the commandments that they broke, you can read about what they did wrong, and you can read that they themselves weren't even following their own religion. There are many Muslims that would say that 9/11 was antithetical to the Islamic faith, that what they did goes against Islam. And I think the same can be said here. For some reason, in the 21st century Latter-day Saints get effectively blamed for what happened in the 1850s. And even back then, in the 1850s, these Latter-day Saints committed some of the worst sins that a living person can commit. And as we'll find out, they paid for it. One of the biggest historical questions is whether Brigham Young ordered the massacre. The sources used here do not show a clear order from Young commanding the attack. His written reply told local leaders not to interfere with the wagon train. At the same time, Young and other church leaders helped create a wartime atmosphere through strong anti-federal rhetoric. A fair reading is that the massacre was carried out by local leaders, while the broader culture of fear and militant language helped make the tragedy possible. And I think that's how do I put it? I think that's probably the best conclusion you can make out of this event, is that there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of uncertainty at the time as to what was going to happen to the Latter-day Saints in Utah. Was the government going to chase the Latter-day Saints and continue to persecute them, despite them even technically leaving the country at the time? And that did not help the situation. And so what we had was a wagon train of innocent people got caught in the worst place to be at the time, which is around a bunch of very scared people who had a different religion, they had a different way of life. They themselves had risked their lives crossing the plains, only to again be threatened by the federal government. And here's a bunch of strangers. Some of them are acting up. Some of them are making fun of the Latter-day Saints. Some of them are causing problems of their own. Nothing that justifies killing them. But it's just such a horrible environment. Anyway, it's just so terrible. Now, early investigations were delayed by the Utah War and later by the Civil War. Federal investigators eventually gathered testimony and evidence showing that local Mormon militia members had participated in the killings. John D. Lee became the main person prosecuted. His first trial ended with a hung jury, but a second trial led to his conviction. Legal records from the trials are still important because they show how difficult it was to separate truth, blame, politics, and self-protection. Now, another thing that was going on at the time was the buildup and the beginning of the American Civil War, which would tie up federal resources because there were a lot of people on the outside that wanted to investigate what had happened here. But with the American Civil War and with everything else that was going on at the time, it made it a pretty easy thing to cover up. The church leaders and the militiamen involved, they did everything they could to cover up this horrible massacre and what had happened here. Again, another layer of deception and dishonesty. And the truth about what happened wouldn't come out for a long time. Now, let's talk about John D. Lee. On March 23rd, 1877, John D. Lee was executed by firing squad at Mountain Meadows, near the place where the massacre occurred. He continued to insist that he had not acted alone, which is true. He did not act alone. Lee's execution did not answer every historical question, but it became the most visible act of legal accountability. Today, the massacre is remembered as one of the darkest events in Latter-day Saint history and as a warning about fear, rumor, obedience, and moral responsibility. Now, a bunch of other people that were involved were also excommunicated from the church. What's important to note about John D. Lee, he had a very interesting your last words. He talked about how Brigham Young and the doctrines that he was teaching was leading the church to hell, which is fascinating. It's an interesting thing to say as your last words, because he was really against Brigham Young's. Brigham Young was a really big proponent of Adam-God theory, as many of us know. And John D. Lee and apparently a bunch of other Latter-day Saints were very much against this teaching, as is the producer of this podcast. So it's fascinating that that's what he decided his last words to be. And this just goes to show, like, the history of the church and the people within it, it's very messy. This isn't a group of people who are all brainwashed to all believe the same thing. The Restoration was a very messy process. And especially at the very beginning, it was a bunch of converts. It was a bunch of people who were coming from a bunch of other religious traditions, trying to put together what's true that they believed and what wasn't true that they believed. John D. Lee, of course, I believe, in my personal opinion, he did end up getting what he deserved here. He got excommunicated and, of course, was executed. I think it's kind of a shame that more people were not brought to justice. But look at that date, 1877. This is, almost 20 years after the massacre? At this point, and you have to keep in mind the time period that they're living in, they don't have forensics, right? Like, they don't have all the criminal investigative tools that we have. I guess it is kind of a miracle anyone got convicted in the end. Personally, I take a lot of comfort. I don't know if comfort's the right word, but I do believe that these people are held responsible in the next life. Murdering innocent people is, again, it's one of the worst things you can do, not just in our religion, but just in just about any religion. And so it is good that justice did eventually come. Now, these are the sources. Now, I did want to talk about, so now that we covered the event and the facts of what happened, I wanted to talk about the way that this has affected Latter-day Saint discourse in the modern day. A lot of us that have served missions have had the Mountain Meadows Massacre thrown in our faces. A lot of us who, have grown up in the church. I mean, a lot of us have heard about it or we've learned about the Mountain Meadows Massacre through our friends, through the people that we work with. It's something that gets brought up as a reason to not be a member of the church. And this is just something that I absolutely have to push against. No one who participated in the massacre was acting the way a Latter-day Saint or a Christian should. Obviously, you can't just start killing people for no reason, and then you can't fake a surrender and then execute them. There's simply no excuse for that. They could have done a million other things. They could have thrown them in jail. They could have negotiated them leaving. They could have done a million different things. There's a million different ways this could have been handled where 120 people didn't get killed. But again, this has absolutely nothing to do with the truth claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What on earth does this have to do with whether or not the Book of Mormon was translated by Joseph Smith or written by him? What does this have to do with whether or not Brigham Young was a prophet of God and held the priesthood keys that he then passed down and then on through the church to today? What does this have to do with the legitimacy of the temple ordinances? What does this have to do with the priesthood? Nothing. There's nothing about this event that challenges the fundamental truth claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that is why I wanted to do this, because Here's the thing. This was an awful event. It is an event in history. It is an event that was participated in by multiple different human beings. And they are just people, and they are fallible, and they made a horrible mistake. And John D. Lee specifically was executed for it, and everyone else was excommunicated that maybe they couldn't get him on legal grounds. But, they could kind of just tell through the spirit or whatever. And they were able to get them spiritually punished in this life at the very least. Justice was served in whatever way it could have, in the very flawed and imperfect way that it was done. And even if it wasn't, what does this have to do with whether or not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true church on earth today? And so it's important to understand this event. It's important to understand what happened, but it's also important to understand that this has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the church is true. That is a separate question. If you want to have a debate about whether or not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true, you need to analyze the production of the Book of Mormon. Did Joseph Smith write it, or did he translate it? Did Brigham Young really hold the priesthood keys or not after Joseph Smith's death? These are the questions that should be asked if you're going to try and figure out whether or not the church is true. But analyzing the Mountain Meadows Massacre and this weird emphasis that ex-members of the church or anti-members put on it, I don't know, it's just always driven me crazy. So anyway, I hope that this was informative. If you liked this podcast, like it and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you in the next one.